Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the concluding day of the symposium commemorating the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution. I am especially thrilled to have the opportunity to listen to my colleague Bob Korstad, who I'm going to introduce in a moment, as well as the dynamic leaders of Trinity College and Gallaudet College, Trinity University and Gallaudet College in Washington, D.C. So we'll hear from all of those folks a bit later this morning, but I think this is going to be as energetic and as exciting a day as we've had over the course of the symposium. Again, I'd like to say thank you to the National Science Foundation and to the Kellogg Foundation for their support. Thank you to Mr. David Ferrero and the staff at the National Archives for so graciously, warmly, and efficiently hosting us for the past few days. I think it's been a fantastic experience being in this space and having the opportunity to visit the archives while we've been here. And again, I must mention three individuals who have been key to the event that we've held here. Once again, Gwendolyn Price, our Director for Strategic Initiatives and Collaborations. Addison Malone, who is the individual who has coordinated a vast amount of this event. And Joanne O'Neill, our financial analyst. But also I'd like to recognize some other individuals and I'd like to ask them to stand, folks who are affiliated with the Cook Center, who I have not had the opportunity to recognize thus far. So if they are present in the room, I'd like to mention Crystalline Cooksey. Crystalline's toward the rear. Lanre Adisa. Akshaya Trivedi. Malcolm Bonner, and Amy Fang. Thank you all. So I'd like to introduce Bob Korstad, who is a colleague of mine at the Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke and also is a faculty member in the Department of History. He is a 20th century historian who has devoted much of his efforts to recovering North Carolina's labor history, as well as the history of social movements in the state of North Carolina. He also heads our initiative on poverty and social justice at the Cook Center, and I'll talk briefly about that in a moment. His most recent book is a history of the North Carolina Fund, an anti-poverty agency in the state of North Carolina that existed for approximately 3 years. It actually had a timeline for going out of existence and did so, which is somewhat unusual, but it also formed the precedent for federal anti-poverty initiatives that subsequently were adopted. And I have a personal connection to this program because my father worked for the North Carolina Fund during the 3-year period of its existence. So I have a real sense of appreciation of the significance of the fund in North Carolina and national history. But Bob also has an earlier book called Civil Rights Unionism, which has been transformed into a jazz musical called Love Songs from the Liberation Wars. And it will be staged in Washington, D.C. at the Tommy Douglas Conference Center in Silver Springs, March 30th through 31st and April 1st. So for those of you who are going to be in the D.C. area at that point, I'm sure you'd like to take the opportunity to hear that and see that performance. And I think it's coming to Durham, hopefully, in September or October. So the key thing that I want to say about the Initiative on Poverty and Social Justice is that much of the work that we do on problems of inequality, race, ethnicity, and inequity have a global or a national scope. But I think we always have to go from the global to the local and vice versa. And Bob's work is very centered on the most local site that's relevant to Duke University, Durham, North Carolina itself. And so you'll hear more about the kind of project that he's been developing at Duke that's focused on the city of Durham, but provides, I think, a template for how other cities might do a similar type of investigation of their individual histories. Okay, so, Bob.
Maybe I can turn this a little bit. Oh yeah, this is nice, so I can see all of you. Great. So thank you, Sandy, and I'll just second all all the thanks that he gave to everyone. Let me just explain a little bit. Now, do I have to? How do I get? No. Okay, there it comes up. Let me just explain what this is that this talk is going to be based on. Jim Laludis and I were asked a few years ago. Jim is a professor of history at Chapel Hill, to do a report, a brief on the history of voting rights in North Carolina for the NAACP's challenge to House Bill, what is it, 589, I think was the number. And so what we did was write a brief that really goes back to the Civil War period up to the present, to try to look at the kind of interplay of race and the franchise in North Carolina. And what I'm going to do today is give you, talk to you about the part that goes up from 1865 to 1900, because I think it's in this context, this kind of local context, and the struggle over the franchise that really helps us understand these amendments. So in North Carolina, as in the nation, race and democratic voting rights have been and remain tightly intertwined. Part of slavery's legacy has been to position race and African American rights as the pivot point in a long contest between conservative and progressive philosophies over one of the most fundamental privileges of citizenship, the right to vote. The contest is often played out in the context of party rivalry, but at its core, I argue that it's driven by differences of ideology in interplay with racial prejudice and our national history of racial discrimination, rather than by partisanship alone, or even primarily. Traditionally, conservatives argue that the state exists solely to defend property rights and preserve public order, and that its authority is limited by a contract with its subjects, who surrender individual liberty only so far as their own welfare is increased and their property protected. By the same logic, those without property have no standing to make demands on government or the wealth of others. Historically, that argument, that principle, has informed arguments for a limited franchise. Progressives, on the other hand, embrace a range of philosophical traditions, from utilitarianism to social Christianity, that are suspicious of the unbridled self. Theirs is a relational system of ethics. The purpose of government is to sustain a commonwealth in which citizens relate to one another through a web of rights and mutual obligations. Progressives place a premium on political participation, because it is through democratic exchange that citizens shape the values that govern the exercise of state power. Now, over time, party labels have mapped onto these principles in shifting ways. In the decades immediately after the Civil War, conservatives called themselves Democrats, campaigned for limited social provision, and took the vote from black men, while Republicans, identified as progressives, championed an expansive state and fought for equality at the voting box. Beginning in the middle of the 20th century, these positions flipped. Grassroots activists and national leaders reshaped the Democratic Party to support the advancement of civil rights, and Republicans allied themselves as advocates of small government, limited federal intervention, involvement and also involvement in state and local affairs, and a protective stance towards citizenship and its attendant rights. The contest over voting rights that runs through these changes of party label and alignment cannot be explained by partisanship. There has been something much more fundamental at stake: racial equality and the right of all citizens to participate fully in a democratic society. When racial equality has been denied and when race has been used for partisan gain or as a mechanism for exclusion from the democratic polity, the result has been a society in which vast numbers of citizens, not only racial minorities, have had their voices silenced and their right to fair and effective representation compromised. When House Bill 589, the bill that was passed by the General Assembly a few years ago, is understood in the context of this history, it is clear that today, as in past years, the future of North Carolina's democracy, for better or worse, will be forged on the anvil of race. On the eve, looking back now, on the eve of the Civil War, North Carolina was more an oligarchy than a democracy. The state constitution ensured that political advantage went to high wealth eastern districts on the coast. Seats in the state Senate were apportioned among 50 districts defined by the value of taxes that residents paid into the state coffers. In the North Carolina House of Representatives, apportionment was governed by the federal ratio, which counted slaves as 3/5 of a person. Property requirements for election to high state office disqualified more than half of the white male taxpayers in the state. And the formula that determined representation in the legislature disadvantaged those citizens even further. Free black men, who comprised a small fraction of the population, had been entitled to vote under the state constitution of 1776, but that right was rescinded by a constitutional amendment in 1835. By 1860, more than 85% of lawmakers in the North Carolina General Assembly were slaveholders, a higher percentage than in any other southern state. Wealth was closely held by this elite, who constituted roughly 7% of the state's population of 1 million and resided primarily in the eastern coastal plain. These men also maintained a firm grip on political power as well as control of wealth. Indeed, the principles of oligarchy were written into the state's constitution. At the local level, voters elected only 2 county officials, a sheriff and a clerk of court. The power to govern rested in the hands of justices of the peace, who were nominated by the members of the House of Representatives and commissioned for life terms by the governor. Now, North Carolina's antebellum oligarchs did not rule with unchallenged authority. In the 1850s, they faced political vote by white yeoman farmers in the central Piedmont and the mountains to the west, who demanded the removal of property requirements for the right to vote for state senators and an ad valorem tax on slaveholders' human property. They wanted to add that. More than slaveholders' property, that was more than 330,000 men, women, and children. Now, the dissenters won the first contest by popular referendum. Ooh, it's a Friday morning. On free suffrage in 1857 and prevailed in the second when delegates in the state secession convention gave ground on taxation for fear that in war with the North, ordinary whites would, quote, not lift a finger to protect the rich men's Negroes. Most of North Carolina remained behind the Confederate lines until the final days of the Civil War, and for that reason, the state bore a Herculean share of the hardship and deprivation. By 1963, North Carolina troops were deserting by the thousands. Many did so with the support from the Order of Heroes of America, an underground network of Unionists and Quaker pacifists. Food riots broke out in the state's capital and its largest towns. And in the 1864 gubernatorial election, William Holden, a self-made newspaper publisher, ran on a peace platform, arguing that a negotiated return to the Union offered North Carolina the only chance to save human life and prevent the impoverishment and ruin of our people. Holden lost to incumbent Zebulon Vance by 58,000 votes. However, his candidacy exposed a deep rift between the state's wealthy rulers and a significant minority of whites, roughly 20% of the population, who had tired of the rich man's war and the poor man's fight. As the defeat grew imminent, Calvin Wiley, a distinguished educator and publicist, warned of the insurrection that the collapse of the Confederacy and the end of slavery would unleash. Quote, "The Negroes and the meanest class of white people would constitute a majority," he warned, "and those who once were socially and politically degraded would make common cause and rise up in rebellion." To forestall this political realignment, self-styled conservatives took advantage of President Andrew Johnson's desire for a quick reconstruction of the South by acting decisively to retain political power and domination over black labor through legislative action. And let me just, a couple slides here. This is the end of the Civil War in North Carolina. This is a wonderful picture of slaves in eastern North Carolina returning to the... Oh, okay. Sorry. Yep. Oops. Back we go. I'll just have to turn this way. In the spring of 1866, conservatives in the North Carolina legislature passed, quote, "an act concerning Negroes and persons of color," known informally as the Black Code. The act sought to keep blacks subjugated and fix their status permanently by attaching to them the same burden and disabilities imposed on free people of color by the antebellum law. Under the Black Code, freedmen could not vote, carry weapons without a license, migrate into the state, return to the state after more than 90 days absence, or give testimony against a white person in a court of law except by the consent of a white defendant. Pretty odd. The law also gave sheriffs broad authority to prosecute freedmen for vagrancy, a crime punishable by hiring out to service and labor. And we've heard plenty about that this week. The Republican majority in the U.S. Congress watched developments in North Carolina and elsewhere in the South with growing concern, particularly for the rights of freedmen. Thaddeus Stevens, senator from Pennsylvania, warned North Carolina conservatives they would have no peace until a Negro is free as a white man and is treated as a white man. To that end, the Congress approved the 14th Amendment to the federal Constitution in June of 1866, intended it to ratification by the state. The amendment gave citizenship to freedmen and struck directly at the Black Code by guaranteeing all citizens an equal protection under the law and forbidding the state to deprive any citizen of life, liberty, or property without due process. In North Carolina, as in all other southern states except Tennessee, conservative lawmakers stood firm. They refused to ratify the amendment that, in their view, turned, quote, the slave master into the master slave, and the slave master and the master slave. Congress answered that defiance by asserting its authority once more, this time through the passage of the Military Reconstruction Act of 1867. The act ordered the continued military occupation of the South, instructed Army commanders to organize conventions that would attempt once more to rewrite the Southern states' constitutions, and granted all male adult citizens of whatever race or color or previous condition the right to vote for convention delegates. This the extension of a limited franchise to black men radically rearranged the political landscape in North Carolina. It was now possible that an alliance between freedmen and dissenting whites could constitute a political majority. With that end in view, opponents of conservative rule gathered in Raleigh in March of 1867 to establish a biracial state Republican Party. William Holden, the Confederate peace candidate, had served briefly as provisional governor after the South's surrender stood at the party's head and directed efforts to build a statewide organization using networks long established during wartime by the Heroes of America and by the Union League in its campaigns to mobilize freedmen. When voters went to the poll to elect delegates at the Constitutional Convention, the leaders of the old elite were stunned. Republicans won 170 of the convention's 120 seats. Of that majority, 15 were black, including religious and political leaders such as James Hood, who presided over the first political convention of blacks in North Carolina in late 1965. 117 delegates, most of them former slaves, gathered in Washington to petition white leaders for adequate compensation for our labor, education for our children, and the abolition of all oppressive laws which make unjust discrimination on account of race or color. During the winter of 1867-68, the new convention drafted a document that defined a thoroughly democratic polity. The Constitution guaranteed universal manhood suffrage, removed all property qualifications for election to high state office, and at the county level, put local government in the hands of elected commissioners rather than appointed justices of the peace. North Carolina would no longer be a republic erected on race and property. The Constitution of 1868 also expanded the role of the state in advancing the welfare of its citizens by levying a capitation tax to fund education in support of the poor, mandating for the first time in North Carolina's history a state system of free public schools, and establishing a state board of charities to make beneficent provision for the poor, the unfortunate, and the orphan. Black delegates to the convention knew that the success of these reforms would depend on safeguarding broad access to the franchise and appealed for the forceful defense of voting rights. The convention passed an ordinance to criminalize efforts to intimidate any qualified elector of the state by violence or bribery or by threats of violence or injury to the person or property. In May of 1868, the voters ratified the new Constitution, elected William Holden governor, and gave the biracial Republican Party 6 of North Carolina's 7 congressional seats, and control of more than 2/3 of the seats in the General Assembly. The scale of the Republicans' victory reflected the fact that in North Carolina, the percentage of whites who crossed the color line and made common cause with former bondsmen was larger than in any other southern state. Historian Paul Escott writes that the state Republican Party, quote, offered a new and vibrant democracy. It seemed inspired with a mission to open up North Carolina's politics and social system. But he observes the party's conservative rivals were determined to make race, not democracy, the central question. They describe Republicans as a mongrel mob spawned by Negro suffrage and social disorder, and they warned non-elite whites of the loss of racial privilege. It is in the poor man's house, the editor of the Wilmington Journal railed, that the Negro will enforce his equality. Such provisions struck deep chords of sentiment in a society that had been organized around racial division for more than 200 years. But in the new order, words alone would not loosen the Republicans' hold on power. To strike the crippling blow, conservatives turned to the Ku Klux Klan and to vigilante violence. So this is a picture of the Constitution. There's Governor Holden. State Senator became John Hyman, a North Carolina Congressman. This is a picture of the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan was first organized in Tennessee in 1868 and subsequently spread across the South. In North Carolina, its leader was one of the conservatives' own, William Saunders, a former Confederate colonel and later a trustee of the State University and Secretary of State. And at UNC Chapel Hill, they just renamed a building that had been named for Saunders in the 1920s. The Klan's mass night riders committed every degree of atrocity, burning houses, whipping men and women, beating with clubs, shooting, cutting, and other methods of injuring and insult. In Graham, they murdered Wyatt Outlaw, the first black town commissioner and constable, and hung his body from a tree in the public square. And in Caswell County, Klansmen lured State Senator John W. Stevens, a white Republican, into the basement of the county courthouse and then beat and stabbed him to death. Violence occurred in all parts of the state, but as the murders of Outlaw and Stevens attest, backlash against black political power was especially fierce in the central Piedmont, where the Klan aimed to intimidate not only black voters, but also the large number of dissenting whites who had crossed the race line. As one Klan leader explained, he and his compatriots aimed not to restore a white man's government only, but marked the phrase, an intelligent white man's government. On July 1870, Governor Holden, the Republican governor, declared Alamance and Caswell counties to the west and north of Orange and Durham counties to be an open insurrection and ordered the state militia to suppress the Klan and arrest its leaders. That move quelled the worst violence, but gave Holden's conservative opponents just the issue they needed to win back control of the state legislature in the fall election. In 1871, conservatives successfully impeached and removed Holden from office on charges of unlawfully suspending the prisoner's right of habeas corpus. From there, the democratic experiment of Reconstruction rapidly unwound. White Northerners were weary of a decade of struggle with the South, had little will to continue the state's rights battle with its neighbors. Slavery had been abolished and succession punished. That was enough for most whites, who found it perfectly consistent to hate the institution of slavery and despise the slave with equal passion. For a majority, racial equality had never been a part of the Civil War's purpose. The last federal troops pulled out of North Carolina in 1877, a year after conservatives, now calling themselves Democrats, elected Zebulon Vance to governor, a post that he'd held during the Civil War. Across the state, Democrats celebrated redemption from what they had long described as the unwise doctrine of universal equality. In an effort to secure their victory, white Democrats abolished elected county government, returned authority to appointed justices of the peace, and limited appointment of offices to whites only. But continued black political participation at the state level sustained what one historian has described as the most competitive two-party system in the South prior to 1900. White Democrats, and this is really interesting, never polled more than 54% in the gubernatorial vote. And between 1877 and 1900, 43 black lawmakers served in the State House of Representatives, 11 served in the Senate, and 4 served in the House of Representatives. Now, the changes that came in the aftermath of Reconstruction, particularly with the rise of sharecropping and the crop lien and the general degradation of the status of white farmers, sent politics in a whole new direction. And in the 1880s, white farmers began to join the Populist Party and the Farmers Alliance, Southern Farmers Alliance, and black sharecroppers and black farmers began joining the Colored Farmers Alliance. And in 1892, these two groups sought redress through the political process. Blacks remained true to the Republican Party, while whites, calling themselves populists now, bolted from the Democratic Party, controlled, as I said, by white elites again, and joined the new National People's Party. The results were disastrous for the populace in this particular electoral period. In the governor's vote that year, I guess this was 1892, the Democratic candidate won 48% of the vote, while Republicans received 33% and populists only 17%. These numbers contained a lesson that was obvious to voters who were less than a generation removed from the biracial politics of Reconstruction. Divided, the dissidents were all but certain to lose. United, they could challenge Democratic power. And that's what they did. In 1894, white populists and black Republicans in North Carolina forged a political partnership. Forged a political partnership under the banner of fusion and ran a historic joint slate of candidates. A former slave named Walter Patilio was one of the fusion's chief architects. After emancipation, he had made a career as a Baptist minister, educator, and reformer. He'd served as superintendent of the schools in Granville County, established North Carolina's only black orphanage, and edited 2 newspapers. Most notably, he also led the organization of the local chapters of the Colored Farmers Alliance, an organization for black farmers and agricultural laborers that paralleled, as I said, the Southern Farmers Alliances. In all of that work, Patilio devoted himself to, quote, bringing about peace and goodwill between the colored and white races. Fusion's logic was indeed persuasive. In the 1894 election, populists and Republicans took control of 74 of the 120 seats in the North Carolina legislature. On the local level in 1894 and 96, they elected more than 1,000 black officials, including county commissioners, deputy sheriffs, school committee, and magistrates. A commitment to participatory democracy, again, we're seeing the kind of the ebb and flow of this, was at the heart of the fusion experiment. Once in power, fusionists undertook a broad program of reform. They capped interest rates at 6%, a godsend for cash-strapped black and white farmers who relied on credit to survive, and restored, once again, elected county government, a Reconstruction-era reform that Democrats had reversed with their return to power. Most important, fusion legislatures revived state election law with the aim of guaranteeing full and fair access to the franchise. And one of the things I think that was really fascinating for us as we were working on this report, and I was reminded when Professor Charles was reading from the Constitution yesterday, is just how important it is to go back and look at the detail in the law that I think spells out so much of what was going on and lets you look at the particular issues that are being contested in this situation. I won't read all of the changes that the fusion has made to the law because it's quite complicated, and a lot of it is very granular in the way that it tries to address issues that were preventing blacks and poor whites from voting at the polls. But just a couple things that they did. They required the clerk of court in each county to lay out very defined precincts with voting places and the times when people were voting. They made them put announcements in the newspaper. So everybody had the opportunity to know where they voted, where they were supposed to be voting, and what the whole process was like. They gave the clerk of court the responsibility of appointing people to guard the polls so that nobody could be intimidated. So people, if they wanted to vote, could. They gave rights to people to be able to take the day off from work, and actually wrote into law that employers, if they did anything in retaliation to workers who walked off to vote, could be fined and imprisoned. That was a violation of fundamental fundamental rights. They tried to make sure that voters, a number of whom were illiterate, had the ability to vote and understand who the people were, so that the individual parties could put banners and posters or cards and stuff with who you wanted to vote for, with a picture of them if that was possible. So the people, and we didn't have secret ballots at that point. And finally, one of the things that I think is really fascinating is the law required public disclosure of all campaign financing. Again, we're a long ways from that, but if you got money from anybody and you were running for office, there were very strict rules about what the information that you had to provide. Now, this new election law, not surprisingly, produced momentous results in the 1896 election. Republican registration overall increased by 25%, and turnout among registered black voters rose from 60 to roughly 90% in 1896 in North Carolina. Fusionists won more than 3/4 of the seats in the state legislature, elected a white Republican, Daniel Russell, as governor. And there were other fusion movements and insurgencies in other southern states. And I think that's something that we really don't understand. Georgia, Alabama in particular, were very close to having similar kinds of takeovers by these biracial alliances. But North Carolina was the only state where this biracial alliance took over control of both the legislature and the executive branches of government. And this is important too. In 1897, in the legislative session after this victory, Fusionists used their supermajority to address 2 decades of Democrats' underinvestment in education. And this was an important issue, obviously, for black Republicans whose predecessors had led the campaign to include a mandate for public schools in the 1868 Constitution, and whose constituents were profoundly disadvantaged by their day-to-day interaction with landlords, merchants, and employers by this inability to read and write and do basic arithmetic. As an act to encourage local taxation for public schools, lawmakers instructed county commissioners to hold elections in the school districts under their supervision, and levying a special tax that was based on property to help pay for the schools and pay equally for black and white schools, which was something that was very different. So there were a lot of social welfare programs that the Fusionists put in action, and the point here is that if you look at what enlarging the electorate and electing large numbers of black representatives means, it's really not just about getting people into office, but it's about the kind of public policies they pursue, and it's about the vision of society that they have. And again, it gets back to that ideological difference that I talked about before. In the interest of time, I won't talk a lot about this because you can read a lot about it and some of you might know, but the white Democrats obviously couldn't stand the kinds of, not only the fact that African Americans and poor whites were now in control of the government, but they were equally disdainful of the kind of public policies that they were pursuing. And so in 1898, Democrats once again made white supremacy their rallying cry, and vigilante violence their most potent political weapon. Responsibility for orchestrating this party's return to power fell to a former Congressman, Farrenfold Simmons, who lived in the eastern North Carolina in what was called the Black Second. And he had been defeated in an election one year by Henry Cheatham, an African American. So he was doubly disappointed or angry at all of this. The Democrats whipped up racial unrest, racial hatred. These are just one of the many cartoons that the News and Observer in Raleigh ran for something like 3 months, and this is just a particular depiction of evoking this whole idea of Negro rule. This kind of bipartisanship, biracial alliance that had been built is somehow translates into democratic rule. They use violence to intimidate people, keep people from the polls, black voters from the polls. In 1898, one of the most important vehicles for this was the kind of recruitment of red shirts, which was another vigilante group, much like the Klan, but under another name. And probably the most important instance of using this political power was in Wilmington, where this biracial alliance had taken control of city government. And in 1898, the white Democrats staged the only coup d'etat in American history, and ran the black and white elected officials out of office. They burned down the press of the local black newspaper, killed dozens and dozens of African American citizens, and also ran hundreds out of town, and basically used the Gatling gun as a tactic of their violent campaign. And in the end, this is a picture of George White, who was the last North Carolina African-American congressman in North Carolina until I think the 1990s. So we went for almost 100 years without an African-American member of Congress. And again, once the Democrats got back in power, they passed a constitutional amendment that basically disfranchised African-American African-American voters, and poor whites too, with poll taxes, with a variety of other techniques. The most important one being literacy clauses that were used to keep people from registering to vote. It didn't really matter whether you could read or write. It was all up to the discretion of individual registrars. And so, again, this is another really important story here. And just to conclude, with this new election law in place, Democrats approached the 1900 election after they had rewritten the Constitution, confident of a victory. Democratic gubernatorial candidate Charles Aycock made disfranchisement the centerpiece for his campaign. On the stump, he offered white electorate a new era of good feeling in exchange for racial loyalty. Aycock argued that the presence of blacks in politics was a source of bitterness among whites, and that only their removal would heal the white body politic. We must disfranchise the Negro, he explained to white workers. Then we shall have peace everywhere. We shall forget the asperities of past years and go forward into the 20th century a united people. To whites who were unconvinced and blacks who were determined to resist, Aycock issued veiled threats. We have ruled by force, we can rule by fraud, but we want to rule by law, he told one nervous audience. In Wilmington, Alfred Waddell, who was the leader of the coup d'etat, was more direct. On election eve, and this is when North Carolinians are voting on the disfranchisement amendment, he exhorted a white crowd, "You are Anglo-Saxons, you are armed and prepared, and you will do your duty. Go to the polls tomorrow, and if you find the Negro out voting, tell him to leave the polls, and if he refuses, kill him. Shoot him down in his tracks. We shall win tomorrow if we have to do it with guns." The beleaguered populace and Republican opposition could not counter the Democratic onslaught with a turnout of 75% of the electors allowed to register under the revised election law of 1899, ACOC and the Disenfranchisement Amendment won by 59% of the votes. Democrat triumph in 1900 cleared the way for a new order characterized by one-party government, segregation, and cheap labor. With the removal of black men from politics, North Carolina's Republican Party became little more than an expression of regional difference among whites that set Western Mountains, the party's surviving stronghold against the central Piedmont and the coastal plain. Leaders of the Democratic Party controlled the selection of candidates through a tightly managed state convention. That arrangement, combined with the fact that no Republican had a realistic chance of winning an election in a statewide office, convinced most electors that there was little reason to cast a vote. Only 50% of newly constrained pool of eligible voters turned out for the 1904 gubernatorial election, and by 1912 the number had declined to less than 30%. So I'll just finish there by saying that this is this takes us up to 1900, and then there's a whole another story about how we get a kind of reemergence of black and white biracial politics in the aftermath of the Civil Rights Movement, and the expansion of the electorate and the expansion of social welfare spending that then once again leads to conservative, in this case Republicans, control of the state government and the kinds of policies we see in North Carolina today. So I think we're at the end of time, and we probably need to start our next panel, it being 10 o'clock. But maybe if we've got time for one question or something, if anybody has any questions. I know there's a lot of information.
So actually, I'm going to take the Schomburg Museum prerogative, where people get up to ask questions, but actually they make statements.
That's good.
but I had some thoughts that I think kind of reinforce the narrative that you're telling. The first is you mentioned other states where there was some form of fusion politics or the equivalent. And so another one would be Virginia with the Readjusters Party. Yeah. Secondly, you mentioned Charles Aycock, the education governor of North Carolina, who was one of the most virulently racist governors in the history of the state. At the time of the Wilmington riot, he actually was in Goldsboro about to get on a train armed to go and kill black folks in Wilmington, and then word came to him that everything was under control, so it wasn't necessary for him to go. And then you mentioned the Gatling gun that was used in Wilmington. Well, the Gatling gun was actually directed and handled by Buck Keenan, who was William Rand Keenan's father. And so, you know, we have a variety of ethics institutes around the country that are named after the Keenan family, but this is a particularly interesting phenomenon. Okay. And then two other thoughts. I was wondering if you might comment on the connection between black leaders and their status as ministers within churches. And what, in some sense, were the pros and cons of that relationship. Right. And then the final thing is something that, you know, Kirsten and I are sandbagging a bit in our book, but Wilmington was not the only municipal coup d'etat. Okay. Okay.
That's good to know. Okay. I'll have to get that information. No, one of the really amazing things was to look at all these black elected officials in this period from 1871, 1872 to 1900. And that's something that people often say, you know, Reconstruction was, you know, over in 1877, and that was the beginning of Jim Crow and segregation, and that was a total clampdown in it. And people often talk about, well, this is the first black elected official since Reconstruction, or this is that. And that's not true. I mean, there's 25 years at least of contestation in the state of North Carolina in which African Americans men are still voting in relatively large numbers despite Democrats' efforts. But what is really fascinating is virtually all of these elected officials were ministers in various denominations in the state, and they used the not only the power of their individual churches and their role in those communities, but I think one of the important things was the way they use church networks and politics to build political bases for themselves and build political influence. Now that had, you know, as Sandy says, had some contradictions in the kind of policies and the things that they pursued, but it was really the base from which black community leaders were able to, black political leaders were able to build power and influence. So you see the kind of the role that those institutions, and I think particularly the networks, played. Church conventions in state and out of state were very important to people in that late period. A lot of the black newspapers were church newspapers, and that was a way of communicating information. So, thank you all for coming, and we'll have another session. Thank you.